Hi again, everybody. This is Mr. McKinney with your Module 25 lesson. It is on the Progressive Era. This is a very important period in American history and South Carolina history. Unfortunately, you're going to see in this short little lesson that the South Carolina Progressive Movement is different in almost all the wrong ways from the United States Progressive Movement. So before we get started, here are the three things that you should be able to do at the end of this week's module. Number one, identify what the goals of the progressive era in the United States were. Number two, describe how the progressive era in South Carolina was different. And like I said, there are many ways, and most of them are negative. And third, list what reforms happened in South Carolina because of the progressive era. Now, despite South Carolina losing its way in the progressive era a little bit, there are some good things that happened and some reforms that took place because of this era in the state. Now, that is a picture of Teddy Roosevelt, one of our most famous presidents of all time. He is one of two what we would consider progressive presidents. Teddy Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson are the two progressive presidents, and they were all about getting reforms put in place. Not all of them were completely universal in their help for all Americans, but they did at least try to reform some things that were problems in America. Now, what were the goals of the progressive movement and what did they stand for? The progressive movement was a local city and state movement that grew into a national movement. So there was really no progressive party in America for a long time. It was just little pockets of support that grew into a national movement. The progressives themselves are all about making social, economic, and political changes for the better. And so the goals included trust busting large businesses. Now, trust busting, if you have a trust, that means you have this huge business and really no competition. It's almost like a monopoly, and it had gotten completely out of hand in the 1900s, early 1900s. So trust busting was goal number one. There was also women's suffrage. That means the right to vote for women. You can see those young ladies standing outside a government building and protesting for them to have the right to vote. Ending child labor. Child labor was a huge problem in the early 1900s. Thousands of children died in the factories and the textile mill villages every year, and the progressives wanted to stop that. And then addressing problems for immigrants. We're going to get to that and how that's different in South Carolina in the next slide. Now, there was this group of journalists called the muckrakers, and basically the muckrakers were the ones that stirred up all the muck and the grime and the dirt on all these issues, and they spread the word about these problems. And so the muckrakers were really instrumental in getting the word out about all these problems that were happening in America. Now, nationally, the two main things that we can point to and say this totally worked. The progressive movement pretty much put an end to child labor, or the beginning of the end of child labor. And the 19th Amendment, women finally did get the right to vote in America with the 19th Amendment. So those are two of the main victories that the progressive movement in America can point to. Now, that's the progressive movement in America. How is it different in South Carolina? Now, first off, I mentioned immigration issues as a national thing. South Carolina never even mentioned immigration, and it's simply because there are no immigrants here in the 1900s. We're not exactly the most welcoming place in the early 1900s. Our economy is not that great. There's racism. There's all those natural disasters we're trying to recover from. So immigrants just simply don't come here. So immigration is not an issue of South Carolina progressives. Instead, there are two main things, or three main things, that we do focus on: ending child labor, or at least improving the conditions of child labor; education, which is terrible at this point in South Carolina history; and women's suffrage. Now, it's sort of by chance that Ben Tillman, that we met in the last module is the governor during the beginning of the Progressive Era. So as you can imagine, he is not going to take kindly to some of these progressive reforms. And putting his own Ben Tillman spin on things, he decides to add one what he calls a progressive reform. And his progressive reform in South Carolina is to disenfranchise African Americans. He wants to make it where 0 African Americans can vote. And to him, that is progress or a progressive reform because he feels like that's when South Carolina started going downhill. Governor Tillman also resisted calls for prohibition. Now, prohibition was a huge issue in America. The 18th Amendment outlawed all alcohol sales, but Governor Tillman did not want this because he controlled the state's alcohol sales. So he was actually making money off the sales of alcohol, and because of that, he did not want alcohol to be prohibited. And sadly, even many women in South Carolina during the time did not support women's suffrage. So there was not a widespread movement of women in South Carolina that wanted women's suffrage, even for their own vote. Now, what successes were there in South Carolina? I kind of painted a really negative picture there. There are some things that are happening in South Carolina that are positive, though. Before I get to that, just a little side note that your read's going to talk about. The progressive movement is happening, and what you've got is this really weird situation in South Carolina where Tillman is trying to take away the right to vote from African Americans, but then they even go a step further and say, you know what? These mill workers, they're not real South Carolinians. Only farmers are real South Carolinians, and these progressives, they're trying to get mill workers more rights. So they're also trying to take the power to vote away from the poor mill workers at this time. Now, here are some advances that we can point to that are actually good things in South Carolina. Child labor laws were introduced. For the first time ever in South Carolina, the child labor law was introduced, and it raised the minimum age of working in a textile mill or a farm. It also put limits on the hours they could work. Tax laws were reformed. For the first time, if you made more money, you had to pay more taxes in the state. And probably the most important thing that they tried to do was actually just increase the amount of public education and increase the quality of public education in South Carolina. South Carolina ranked near the bottom of education in the United States. Part of that was because we only made people go a few months a year. We also didn't have a 12th grade. Now, despite all this positivity in education and this increased funding for education, graduation rates remain very low because there just aren't any high schools where you can go to finish your education in South Carolina. It's very difficult to finish your degree during this time in South Carolina. And we're going to get into World War I. Next week's module is all about World War I. That's what's actually going to end the progressive movement because everybody kind of focuses in on World War I after World War I starts, the Zimmerman telegram, and the Germans attack our ships, and that is a huge problem. So, today's word of the week, or I guess this week's word of the week, we're going to go with suffrage. Suffrage is the word of the week. And I hope you guys have a great week, and I will talk to you soon.